for a couple of years now, buddy, but you're still fighting the war.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of GCV's flagship podcast, Shoulder to Shoulder, where we discuss issues that are pertinent to military members, their families, and veterans. I am Will Selber, also known as GCV or GCV6. I am honored today to have one of my intellectual heroes, Ambassador Eric Edelman, who is also a writer at The Bulwark, and he is also the host of quite possibly my favorite podcast, Shield of the Republic. And so I am honored today to have Ambassador Eric Edelman on Shoulder to Shoulder to discuss Turkey, what's going on there, and how that relates to other hotspots in the region. Ambassador Edelman, it's an honor to have you on, sir.
Well, thanks very much, Will. It's great to be with you, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I am a longtime reader. I often tell people that I have on here that your writings are one of the things that I assign to new officers who came into my squadron to read and to learn about foreign affairs, because the real good stuff isn't just coming in on that top secret computer that you have. The real good stuff, that information is useless to you if you don't have the context behind it. And so I just wanted to let you know that I'm a big fan, and I think that all my subscribers should be listening and watching Shield of the Republic as often as they can.
Well, thank you, Will. I appreciate that.
Yes, sir. Ambassador Edelman, could you just give me maybe some of your thoughts and maybe a little background on what's going on right now in Turkey with Erdogan?
Well, Turkey, of course, is a country that is crucially geopolitically located. It exists, as you will well appreciate, on the cusp of the divides of our unified command plan.
Yes.
So it sits in EUCOM, but it abuts some very important parts of CENTCOM. As well, a neighbor of Russia's, because it's a major Black Sea power.
Yes, sir.
And it actually controls, under the Montreux Convention, access in and out of the Black Sea. Turkey just is very important geopolitically. It's been a U.S. ally formally since 1952 when it adhered to NATO. But it was actually an ally before that. It actually was one of the countries that raised its hand and said, we'll fight alongside the United States in the Korean War, which is one of the reasons why NATO was enlarged to include Turkey. That relationship we should not look back on with rose-colored glasses. It's always had ups and downs. There was lots of anti-Americanism in Turkey during the Vietnam era, for instance. And we've had, difficulties with Turkey's government because beginning in the early 60s, it had a series of military coups of various sorts that, made it difficult to continue to consider Turkey as a, kind of fully fledged member of what was meant to be an alliance of democracies. Mm-hmm. So we shouldn't have rose-colored glasses about it. Turkey was a very important ally throughout the Cold War of the United States. Under Recep Tayyip Erdogan became prime minister in 2002 or 2003. Turkey, his government came into power in late 2002. He became prime minister in the spring of 2003. Turkey has become, over the last 20 plus years, an increasingly difficult, unpredictable ally. And some of that unpredictability has gone hand in hand with Erdogan's growing authoritarianism and his various steps he's taken that have undermined Turkish democracy. But of course, still abuts very important geography for the United States, a neighbor of Syria's, a neighbor of Iraq's, a neighbor of Iran's, a neighbor of Russia's. What's happened most recently in Turkey is really there are two things that are going on here. One is external and the other is internal. And I would say, for purposes of our conversation, Will, and for your listeners, the important thing to understand about Turkey is that everything Erdogan does in foreign affairs is ultimately rooted in his domestic agenda.
Right.
And his domestic agenda is continuing to maintain his own political power in a polity that has become increasingly what political scientists like to call a hybrid authoritarian regime or an electoral authoritarian regime. Is to say, it has the outward forms of democracy, free elections,
Mm-hmm.
but it is increasingly essentially a one-man show and a personalistic regime, not unlike Russia, very, very, very similar, a sort of ideological, complexion in a way, because both of the systems have become, again, what scholars call patrimonial,
Yeah.
which is to say that they're not rooted in sort of Western traditions of rights and hearing and citizens. It's rather what you get is it comes from the grace of the sovereign.
Mm-hmm.
Putin in the case of Russia,
Mm-hmm.
Erdogan in the case of Turkey. So the domestic backdrop here is that Erdogan has pursued for many, many years economic policies that are quite heterodox. He, for many, many years, was pumping up the economy with lots of cheap credit and government spending, essentially to bribe voters. This is sort of classic populism.
Mm-hmm.
Bribe voters to vote for you in the election because you're giving them economic goodies. But he refused to allow, which of course fueled inflation, and he refused to allow the central bank to raise interest rates. I mean, multiple central bank chiefs fired, replaced by, more pliant factotum who would carry out his kind of war against what he called the interest rate lobby, which had, more than passing overtones of anti-Semitism, which he is prone to indulge in.
Yes.
To the point where, a year or so ago, inflation was raging at about 80%.
Mm-hmm.
And the economic circumstances of the country were so straitened by all of this that he suffered the first real, completely incontrovertible political defeat of his tenure. And in particular, the popular mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, was reelected mayor over Erdogan's objections. Erdogan had tried to stop him when he was first elected in 2019, forced a rerun of the election. İmamoğlu won by even more. And İmamoğlu is the most popular politician in Turkey, or one of the two or three most popular, who consistently runs ahead of Erdogan in public opinion polls. Erdogan is also constrained by the Constitution. He's term limited, and his term runs out in 2028. He could get around that technically by calling an early election, which would get around the 2028 problem. But he's also been seeking a way to overturn the term limit. And in order to do that, he has had to reach out to Kurdish politicians to get him in the parliament to the 28 term limit. And that is the backdrop for his overture to the incarcerated leader of the PKK, the Kurdish Turkish political party, terrorist group, political party and terrorist group that has waged a brutal insurgency in Turkey for more than 40 years.
Sir, I was actually recently in Istanbul. I don't know if you knew that. I went in January, and I was surprised, sir. It was my first time in Istanbul. Interesting. I went all over the place. I wound up befriending a Kurdish cab driver,
Uh-huh.
and my bad Arabic and Farsi met his bad Arabic and Turkish, and we figured it out. But I asked him about the PKK. And once he realized that I knew what it was and that I understood Erdogan and that I wasn't somebody that was going to be a threat to him, boom, boom. And like all this stuff started flowing out of his mouth. And then he took me around to some of the places and I met with other Kurds. And I was, I understand that for us in the West, we can look at them and say they're terrorists. There's also, we may view them that way. There's a lot of supporters in that part of the world who don't view them that way.
Right. Yeah. So, it is complicated. I don't think we should romanticize the PKK. They did wage a very ugly insurgency. It wasn't, I don't think, managed by the various governments of Turkey, including predecessors to Erdogan's, particularly well. But the major point is Erdogan reached out to Öcalan, who has been incarcerated since the late 1990s, got him to agree to call for a ceasefire in the civil war and for the PKK to lay down its arms. Not completely clear what Kurds get for this in the meantime. I mean, Erdogan has been ruthlessly cracking down on the Democratic Kurdish Party in Turkish politics, which it has been pretty popular. In fact, the head of that party, Selahattin Demirtas, has been in prison for almost a decade now.
Yeah.
So it's not completely clear what they're going to get out of all of this, but this clearly was something that Erdogan needed for domestic politics. Now, interestingly, Öcalan said nothing about the Syrian Kurds, whose group, the YPG, which is an offshoot of the Turkish PKK, and whose fighters have made up the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, with whom CENTCOM and our colleagues have been fighting for more than a decade against ISIS. And they've been good allies. They've been extremely capable. And they now, by the way, have the Overwatch mandate for a series of camps where some 40,000 ISIS fighters and their families are currently detained.
Yep.
So there's a big counterterrorism set of concerns here. Erdogan was initially, actually, when I was ambassador 20 years ago, Erdogan was really quite taken with sort of trying to improve relationships with Bashar al-Assad. I mean, the relationship with Assad's father had been not very good. And in fact, in the late 90s, the Turks mobilized their military on the Syrian border, in part because Öcalan was residing in Damascus, from where he was orchestrating this civil war against Turkey. That forced the Syrians to kick Öcalan out. We ended up helping render him back into Turkish custody, although we don't get much credit for that from the Turks. And when the civil war broke out in Syria, Erdogan sort of reflexively began to back the Muslim Brotherhood-oriented groups with their roots in the Muslim Brotherhood, notably the Al-Nusra Front, which was an Al-Qaeda affiliate.
Yep.
And that affiliate ultimately broke with Al-Qaeda and broke with ISIS and became Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which ended up controlling, after the sort of joint Iranian, Russian, Syrian government offensive against the opposition in 2015, that movement ended up controlling kind of the only kind of enclave left, except for what the Kurds had in northeastern Turkey, northeastern Syria, for fighters opposed to Assad. Erdogan and his regime provided a lot of support for these guys, financial support. They allowed the financing to run through Turkey, provided them with medical assistance and care for wounded fighters, provided them with arms, or at least access to arms. And so there's a very deep relationship between Farouk al-Shara, the former head of HTS, now president of Syria. I want to tie off this one thought. Erdogan sort of gave the green light to Shara, then al-Jalani, as a nom de guerre, to launch the December offensive to take back a couple of key cities that had been captured by Assad over the course of the civil war. I don't think he ever dreamed that Shara would topple the government in 3 weeks. I think he thought they might take back a couple of these cities, but they had what you might call catastrophic success.
Yes.
And ended up controlling the country. And now Turkey is the sort of they don't have dispositive control, but they have, I would say, predominant influence with the current new Syrian regime, in part because of long-standing contacts between the former head of Turkish intelligence, now Turkey's foreign minister Hakan Fidan, with Shara, and so. Turkey's, very influential. They're looking to expand their role and influence, including potentially Air Force bases, which might bring them into conflict with Israel. And so, you've got this, internal and external set of factors going. Syria was his Syria policy very unpopular for Erdogan because it led to 4 million Syrian refugees inside Turkey. He needs Syria to be stabilized. We can push those people out. and pursue his domestic agenda. And not only is he trying to change the Constitution, he didn't want to take any chances. If he does get the Constitution changed and can run again, he's now taken steps to remove Imamoglu, the mayor of Istanbul, from the political equation by first having his university degree reversed. Turkish law, you have to be a university graduate to be president. But then imprisoning him for trumped up charges of support for terrorism, support for the PKK, the very people Erdogan is actually negotiating with right now, corruption. And as we speak, actually, Imamoglu is making his first appearance in court. So
I want to just focus in on a couple of points here. Have we made our peace with Al Qaeda? And I'm not talking about a formal peace, but have we just decided that we're okay with them? I ask that because we now have in Syria Jolani, who was a former Al Qaeda commander who was detained at Camp Bucca. And now we have in Afghanistan Hibatullah Akhundzada, who is Al Qaeda, because Al Qaeda still pledged bayat to the Taliban. And so we now have basically two former Al Qaeda or Al Qaeda affiliated leaders in two countries. And for me, as somebody who focuses on really counterterrorism, I'm very alarmed by that because you provide your enemies time and space. And while your short-term interests align right now, at some point they won't. And they're going to be preparing for that moment because they're in Afghanistan. Just go on Twitter, everybody. I'm not making this up. You can see them mass producing suicide bombers. They're in the madrasas, I'm horrified by this, sir.
Yeah, Will, it's a great question. I would separate what's going on in Syria from what's going on in Afghanistan.
Okay.
I mean, what you describe in Afghanistan, I share your concerns totally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have essentially turned a blind eye. And moreover, the current administration seems to be taking steps that would appear to be moving in the direction of some kind of normalization Afghanistan. And I do find that extremely...
Oh, Zal's back.
I find that very worrisome. I also am a little worried. I mean, it's inter alia with threats to, quote, go after the commanders who were involved in the pretty disastrous, shambolic withdrawal under the Biden administration from Afghanistan. Although I don't think that General Donahue, for instance, is culpable in any way for this is a confusion between military officers who were executing orders and civilian leaders who made, I think, many mistakes as they looked at the situation in Afghanistan. Something, by the way, that I was writing about before the fall in the Bulwark.
Mm-hmm. I was reading it, sir. I was there in Afghanistan during the time, and I was like, can somebody see what's happening?
Yeah.
Because I was there. I was working at the embassy at the time, and I was just like, this is not good.
Yeah. No, I wrote about it in the Dispatch and then in the Bulwark and in a conversation in July with Bill Kristol where I was ringing the alarm bells about what might happen. But anyway.
Sorry.
I think Syria is a little different.
Okay, sir.
And I think it's the concern is valid. And I've got two concerns about what's going on in Syria. So first, al-Jolani undoubtedly did break with al-Qaeda and did break with ISIS, and he claims to have, changed his views, and he wants to have a kind of inclusive government in Syria, which would be in everybody's interest. Mm-hmm. My view is we should try, test that proposition and treat it with, appropriate skepticism, but not rule it out a priori that, people change.
Fair enough.
Maybe he's seen the light, but I do think it means that the United States needs to have some pretty serious conditionality on any easing of sanctions on Syria. I mean, we, Israel, Turkey, all share an interest in having Syria be, come out of this as a stable, government. I don't think we should harbor any illusions that it's going to end up, looking like a normal, what we would consider a normal democratic state. But it could be a more pluralistic, quasi-democratic country, which would already be an advance over what it was before. And the other concern I have, of course, is, and this is where the Turkish role comes in, and the role of the Kurds in Syria comes in. I do worry about continued ISIS activity in Syria and what happens to these 40,000 detainees. And that is crucially, in my view, depends on the continued presence of the 2,000, U.S. Special Forces folk
Yes.
who are there providing overwatch to this, and also on Iran's efforts to rebuild its proxy network in Syria. We already know that they're doing that.
Yes.
We had an incident a few weeks ago on the
Mm-hmm.
coast where
Yep.
some Alawite forces from the former regime, clearly sponsored by the Iranians,
Of course.
created a huge mess. There were atrocities on both
Both
sides,
sides.
but it was very, very messy, and clearly, the Iranians were at the bottom of the pile there. So I think, I'm worried a little bit. There's been, as I said, there was no guidance from Öcalan about what the Syrian Kurds were supposed to do.
Yeah.
They have reached an agreement with al-Shara that they will ultimately allow their militias to be integrated into a new national Syrian defense force. So obviously there's ongoing negotiation. They've also complained that they think that the new Syrian government, which was meant to be more broad-based and inclusive, is not actually broad-based and inclusive enough. So that's going to be an ongoing thing we need to, worry about. What concerns me is in both 2018 and 2019, President Erdogan got on the phone with President Trump, persuaded him to withdraw our forces from northeastern Syria,
Yeah.
and only with great difficulty was Secretary Mattis and were others able to persuade President Trump that it was not really a good idea to pursue that all the way to the end. But I worry that he's going to see this as another endless war. Let's just get out of it, and that will create an opening for the ISIS folk.
Yes.
To escape from their containment right now, and
that's my worry, sir. This
pose a
is my
threat.
worry. Let me tell you my worry. All of this, where I agree with like testing the theory and all that type of stuff. If we had an administration who had staffed the intelligence community with non-political actors who are not predisposed to manipulate and politicize intelligence, which I've been a part of, to twist it into a narrative that suits what you're doing. And I think at the very least, we can say that Trump is not beyond doing something like that, right? And that from my own personal experience, and it really colors how I see this, is that, I hunted Jelani personally at CENTCOM and at other places, and I know him very well. I'll just say that. And I don't believe for a second that he's changed. I hope I'm wrong. There would be nothing would make me happier than 10 years from now, it's like President Jelani. He's become Arafat, right? Or something like that. Something that, I don't know, whatever the right analogy would be, right? I don't know what it would be, but I just never bet on somebody who was a former Al-Qaeda that's going to totally change stripes. And I hope that the American intelligence community is really keeping close track of him and who he is and is not communicating with, and that information is actually informing policy. That's my worry, sir.
Yeah, and it's a very good worry and a very good concern. I mean, to your point, I just before I came on the show, someone sent me a news item that the DNI has appointed Will Ruger to be the person in charge of producing the president's daily intelligence brief. Will Ruger is someone who has been inveighing against, quote, endless wars for a number of years. He's part of the Koch-funded, Defense Priorities, Cato Institute, kind of isolationist kind of world. And so to your point about, how the intelligence is being shaped, I worry a little bit, that
especially, who's going to be left inside the intelligence community as it's being, I know I have lots of friends inside the intelligence community, and I will just say that everybody's just like stopped in an orbit because they don't know what's going to happen and they don't know who's going to be fired.
Right.
And so that has created a freeze all the way down, and people are scared because for the first time in my lifetime, or that I can remember, we have a sitting president who will fire anyone,
Right.
whether he has cause or not.
I guess, what worries me is that the person who prepares the president's daily intelligence brief, and I used to be a PDB recipient, both when I was in the office of the vice president.
It's a great product.
And when I was Undersecretary of Defense. And the person who prepares that product, in my view, needs to be an intelligence professional.
Yes.
Not an outside, ideological advocate.
Yes.
Of any point of view.
Right.
And unfortunately, if this report about Will Ruger is correct, that's not what we're going to have. And so, I think that's a concern for.
And this is the same concern that I have when sir, if you don't mind, like maybe kind of pivoting this to Ukraine a little bit. I have discussions with people who are more sympathetic to Trump's point of view. And they always present the argument that I'm sure you're familiar with of like, Russia's a nuclear power. It's not worth it. We need to stop it here, get what we can. We hold. We pivot again to China, the pivot to China that has been happening my entire adult life. And that, right, it's going to happen any day now. And I always reply like to their best case scenario. And my response is always simple. If that's happening, I didn't see that in the first Trump term. What I saw was the Doha Agreement, where he ridiculed his allies, said that they were corrupt, said they didn't fight, excluded them from the peace table, and directly negotiated with their adversary. And if it was President Romney or whatever, and he was doing this, I'd be like, interesting. Well, let's see if he's actually going to back up with a real stick against Putin. But every time that I've seen Trump is that he says he's going to fight. And then when it gets a little bit disadvantageous for him and his own personal interests, he'll break contact and say, peace has been achieved. Now on to the next thing.
So, I agree, Will. So, So certainly in terms of the Doha Agreement, one of the things that, disturbed me the most about when the Biden team took over, I advised them not to let themselves get sucked into the Doha Agreement. And they, decided to, go ahead and
do it.
And do it anyway. I do worry that, we're going to see something like that. President Trump, it's not just Doha, by the way.
Right.
If you think about the North Korea negotiations in the first Trump term.
I was there when it was going on.
The president, had 2 meetings with Kim Jong-un and proclaimed that the, nuclear threat from North Korea was over and that we should stop our regularly scheduled joint exercises with the South Koreans because that was a provocation, he said, to the North. So, and that was essentially a completely, unilateral concession, corresponding concession from North Korea.
Yeah.
So I do worry that there's a potential for that. Again, as I was coming on to the show today, I saw that the president had truthed out on Truth Social, something, and it was repeated by Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, that Trump was losing patience with Russia. He said this before, but despite, the losing patience with Russia, nothing ever happens to Russia. There's never any consequence, as opposed to Ukraine, which is when Zelensky ticked Trump and Vance off in the famous meeting in the Oval Office. Immediately, intelligence sharing was stopped, the assistance was cut off, and only, after some intercession by allies and some creative efforts by President Zelensky to propitiate Trump led to the things being restored. I also worry that Steve Witkoff, who is the negotiator now, not only for the Gaza ceasefire, but also, for Russia and now for the Iranian nuclear program, is somebody who I think is completely out of his depth. He has no experience in all of this. as far as the Ukraine negotiations go, he's shown a disturbing tendency to parrot talking points from the Kremlin that clearly he's heard from his counterpart, who is Kirill Dmitriev, who is the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, who's very close to Putin. His wife went to school with Katerina Tikhanova, Putin's daughter, and he is much more important on the Russian side than Foreign Minister Lavrov or diplomatic advisor and former U.S. and former Russian ambassador to the U.S. Yuri Ushakov. And I regard Dmitriev, who is, as the president, our president might say, is right out of central casting, right? Stanford.
He loves central casting.
Yeah, exactly. So he's Stanford educated, Harvard Business School, Goldman Sachs, speaks perfect English. He must be smart. And therefore, we should, listen to whatever he says. And Witkoff seems to have fallen for this. I mean, I've described to Dmitriev to others as the Witkoff whisperer, because you can see that he's been in these meetings with Dmitriev, and Dmitriev says things, and then Witkoff, repeats them. And Dmitriev's no fool, and Putin's no fool. They know how to appeal to Trump.
Yes.
So
I think sir, do you mind if I have a question about just
please, yeah.
about Putin? I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I would like to maybe just end on this. Did we completely underestimate Putin? Because all I heard was, for a while, I'm not a Russia guy, and I never claimed to be. I've written one article on Ukraine, and when I found out that Kathy Young was going to edit it, and I automatically became horrified. And so I asked this just to learn. Did we underestimate him? Because when I was reading what was going on, it was like after the initial part had crumbled, it was like, oh, he's not as great as he thinks he is. There was the attempted coup, which he put down. And then it was like, oh, the counteroffensive is going to be amazing. And we kind of just felt that he was gone. But then it seems to me as a Russia reader that he just opened up the jails and let everybody else out into the feeders like he did in Stalingrad, and just go ahead and get killed. Go ahead and get killed.
So, I mean, I think you put your finger, Will, on something that, is a classic kind of American kind of tendency, right? We thought the same thing about Saddam Hussein after the first Gulf War, right? If you read President Bush's and the late Brent Scowcroft's memoir, they thought Saddam would be gone in a matter of months. So we didn't need to finish the job, in the first Gulf War. Similarly, I think people assumed Bashar al-Assad was going to be gone after, the first few months of the uprising in Daraa in Syria and the start of the civil war there. And that turned out to be, disastrously wrong too. So yes, I think there was mostly an underestimation of how fixated Putin is on Ukraine, and how important he sees destroying Ukraine as a sovereign, Western-oriented nation is to his larger conception of his role in history and his legacy in Russia. Somebody asked Lavrov, the foreign minister, who's been there for about 20 years now, I think maybe the longest-serving Russian foreign minister in history. If not, he's certainly... Yeah. He's certainly getting up there on Gromyko, who was there for 28 years. So he's getting close. He was asked, which advisors does Putin listen to? And he reputedly said, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great.
That's exactly right. And that should horrify all of us, because in my opinion, if he signs something, it's not worth the paper it's signed on. I don't trust him at all. That's just me. I'm just a grumpy combat veteran. But I will also say this in closing out. One of my last concerns, sir, and if you want to opine on it as we close out, feel free to do so. From an intelligence and counterintelligence perspective, what President Trump has done inadvertently has created a huge pool of potential recruits for the Russian intelligence and Chinese intelligence services. Don't forget that 10 years ago or so, the Chinese got every one of our SF-86s. So now they have who we are and who the ones that have top secret clearances. If I was them, I would go, who's just got fired? Hey, let's go call them. Maybe we can have somebody come up to me and be like, did you get fired? That's horrible. I can't believe somebody would fire you. Like, tell me about it. And thus it begins. This is classic espionage. You target people who are disaffected by the current government.
I agree totally, Will. I think, we've created a lot of, we've created a huge counterintelligence problem for ourselves because we have created a pool of potential recruits. And I don't think it's an accident at all that, there are reports that have been in the Washington Post and New York Times that the Russian and Chinese intelligence services are already actively looking to see who they can recruit. And I'm sure, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the road, we're going to have all sorts of stories of different people who provided them, with different kinds of information. The other thing that's gone along with that has been, the dismantling of a number of elements of our own efforts to protect ourselves, particularly against disinformation, whether it's CISA and the bill of attainder he signed the other day, to investigate former director of CISA, Christopher Krebs, the dissolution of various FBI and other task forces that were meant to be looking at this, both the information domain, but also corruption. Corruption task forces, we're not going to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. All these things are being dismantled. All of this is just an absolute bonanza for our adversaries' intelligence services.
Absolutely. Well, Ambassador Edelman, we'll leave it on the always depressing note that we're known for on Shoulder to Shoulder. We sticked on brand here at Grumpy Combat Veteran, but I want to thank you, Ambassador Edelman, for coming on, making time out of your very, very busy schedule. Please know that Shield of the Republic has a lot of fans, and so does your writings. And I want to thank you for your distinguished service to this country and your continued effort to educate and mold America's foreign policy in what is a rather dark time for people of our ilk and viewpoint. And I hope that I think you would agree, nothing would make me happier than to be completely wrong about all of this.
Yep.
And that for Trump to do the peace deal and then everything works out, that would be great. I don't think that's going to happen, but I'm happy to be proven wrong. And I'm sure you agree.
I agree. And let me just return the compliment and just say, thank you for doing Shoulder to Shoulder. Thank you for all the things you have written in the Bulwark about counterterrorism, about your service and the service of others with whom you've served. I think it's very important for the American people to understand what's been going on over these last 20 years in these difficult wars, and to appreciate the service of people who've done a lot to defend our country. If I could just finish on one point.
Please, sir.
It's tempting to say, because of the way the war in Afghanistan ended tragically, and because of the fact that, Iraq has not turned out quite as we hoped, that all of this was in vain, that this was a terrible waste. And you see some elements of this in what the Trump administration argues and talks about. I would try and point out, and particularly because so many people now, younger people, were not around for 9/11. The one thing that is incontrovertible, and for all my criticisms of the Obama and Biden administrations, the thing that is incontrovertible is we have never suffered another mass casualty attack on the United States, on the territory of the United States, since 9/11.
Yes.
And that's not because our adversaries weren't trying to do it.
That's an excellent point, Ambassador, and that is exactly why he's an ambassador, and I'm just a grumpy combat veteran. Until next time, I hope all of my listeners are prosperous and that you enjoy your time with your family. I'm GCV6, and I'm out.